All right. Thank you for your patience with me and a brief hiatus there, a little fall break, if you will. Uh, as being an adjunct professor, this is one of the things that can happen from time to time. This isn't my full-time job, and so I do occasionally run into difficulties where I have to adjust things a bit on the fly. I do always, as I said in my email, build in a little extra time here and there so that just in case I run into problems, we're okay. And so we'll be fine for the rest of the semester. We have, as I said, we have time built in, and we'll get things done just fine. So I look forward to us getting rolling here and finishing up. Uh, all right, let's talk about Chapter 6, which is initial proposals. And the biggest thing here is sort of figuring out, where do I start? How do I know where to start? Um, and how do I know whether what I'm saying is going to make sense? Is it going to be right for my client? How do I know those things? Well, the answer is you don't necessarily. You have to sort of figure it out. How do I figure that out is the question, right? Well, one, what's the industry you're in? I've been in the personal injury in law practice, either as plaintiff or defense, for the better part of 20 years. And so, as a result of that, um, what I've learned is that the industry standard is very simple. The plaintiff normally is the one who makes the first opening demand. Now, does that always happen? No, but it's typical. What happens is that the plaintiff has put their case together and sends a demand package, if you will, to the insurance company and asks for a certain amount of money. One of the things that then happens is that the insurance company looks at it and decides, does this make sense? Does it not make sense? And let me give you a for instance. If your client is in a Cadillac Escalade and gets hit by a Ford Fiesta at 10 miles an hour and you say, I want $5 million, not so much. Insurance company is not going to take that seriously. So one of the things that you can think about, even though realistically, practically, and frankly, based on all the research, initial demands that are bold, shall we say, usually result in better outcomes. Obscene doesn't. In the Pantalone negotiation that you just did not about a week ago, gosh, if you were the prosecutor and came out with, well, we want the death penalty, if I'm the defense attorney, I'm not taking you very seriously. I mean, come on. Got a couple rocks of crack cocaine in his pocket, assuming it was his pants, but even so, death penalty, don't, it's stupid. You can't even get the death penalty anyway. So you have to be careful about those things. High is good, but not like that, not obscene. What if you just don't know? You have no idea. I mean, you really, truly, you just don't know where to start. Well, whether you're an attorney or not, or whether you're negotiating on behalf of a company or an organization, you're going to have to figure out what the norms are in that negotiating community, whatever they might be, and you're just going to have to ask around. There's just no other solution to that. You can take a stab in the dark if you want to do that, and if you feel like, well, there's really no one I can ask, then just make sure you err on the side of being a little, think of what you think would be sort of a bit high and then add something to it. That's the best advice I can offer if you just have absolutely no idea. Ask questions of the other side. I mean, and again, remember, whenever you're unsure about something, ask questions. I told you at the beginning that you would hear this mantra from me again and again. Questions unasked are questions unanswered. And so keep that in mind and ask away if you need to ask in order to figure out how you're going to start. Who starts the negotiating rolling? Well, as I said, in some instances there are standards. I mean, in real estate, it's typically the buyer who offers the seller an amount of money, although technically, usually, the seller has put the real estate on the market at a particular price. So I mean, I guess technically the seller has already thrown a number out there, so to speak. So maybe the seller's really made an initial offer. But usually it's the buyer who then comes back and says, okay, well, here's what I'm willing to do. And then that really kind of gets the ball rolling in the negotiation. So that would be sort of the norm that you would expect. What I would say basically, though, is how does your client feel about it, and what benefits your client the most? What's the best thing for your client to do? If it's best for your client to wait, then you need to coax the other side into giving you some kind of proposal. If it's best for your client to be very aggressive, then you need to get a proposal out there as quickly as possible. That depends on so many circumstances that there's just no way to really deal with it here other than to say that's just something you're going to have to work through and think through very carefully and strategically. Basically, if it benefits your client to make the first proposal, then you should do it. That's kind of my attitude. Otherwise, it may not matter. And if it doesn't matter, then who cares? Go ahead, don't go ahead, don't worry about it. One of the things I will tell you right off the bat, I'm looking over here at my notes, don't give someone a range. I mean, the worst thing you can do, and I see this all the time on TV shows, and I mean, the so-called reality shows, you know, for instance, Pawn Stars, you might watch that from time to time on the History Channel. My 16-year-old son, loves that show. And I'll see people come into the pawn shop, and the first thing that the guys at the pawn shop ask is, well, how much do you want for your whatever, your Civil War gun? And they'll say, oh, I don't know, $2,000 or $3,000. Well, guess what? You've already started the negotiations at $2,000 at a maximum. They already know you're willing to take $2,000 if you start there. You can't do that. Don't give a range, because the other side's automatically going to go to the low end of your range because you've already communicated a willingness to accept the low end of the range. So just don't give a range. I mean, that's sort of one of those nevers, you know, just don't do that. It's just a bad idea. Unless, and then so here's the exception, of course, unless you have a very good strategic or tactical reason to give a range. And then, of course, if it benefits your client to give a range, then do it. But that's pretty unusual. Most of the time, you won't want to be giving those kind of ranges out, just for the very reasons that I've noted. Watch Pawn Stars one day if you get a chance. That's not really, I mean, that's not real true negotiation. Well, I don't know. It is negotiation in a sense, because there are discussions about not just dollars and cents, but also, well, why is it worth what it's worth? So I mean, you know, it may be worth watching an episode or two just to see how they ask questions and they discuss. You know, somebody brings in, you know, I saw one the other day where this person brought in a edition of a Peanuts comic strip book, or you know, and it had a drawing of Lucy in the front cover and signed by Schultz, the guy who did the Peanuts comic strip. And the question was, A, is the signature real, and B, is the picture of Lucy, was it really done by Schultz, and I can't remember his first name, but was it really done by him? So they brought in an expert and had the expert look at it and say, oh yeah, it kind of does look like it, so you know, it's therefore worth whatever it was worth, and I don't remember now. And so there was some question asking, and before any proposal actually was made by either side, there was sort of some discussion and some asking of some questions about the validity of the signature and so forth. So maybe it's worth looking at. I don't recommend it, because after that it's usually just, hey, you know, 500, no, 450, oh, how about 475, and they meet in the middle, and that's the end. Not every time, but all right. Use clear-cut language when you make your proposal. Make sure that you've made it very clear what you're looking for and why. It's just always a good idea to do that. Be prepared to justify what you're doing in a reasonable and rational way. Okay? Understanding that no matter what you say, you will never fully convince the other side of what you're saying. You just never will, because they want to get something else. So inevitably, no matter how good your arguments are, no matter how reasonable they are, no matter how rational the things you say, that does not mean the other side's going to simply roll over and capitulate and go, oh, well, obviously. That's typically not what happens. But still, nonetheless, you should always strive to be as rational and reasonable as you can in making that initial proposal. Now, why do I say all these things about the initial proposal? Well, because it sets, and I think, I don't remember if Gifford talks about this now, um, but there's this concept of anchoring, and that may be in the Getting to Yes book, and I'm sorry, I can't remember now. It's been a while since I read that and prepared these notes. But this concept of anchoring becomes important sometimes, where when you start the negotiation, it kind of anchors it at that location. So if again, to use the personal injury analogy, just because it's simple and easy, if the guy in the Escalade gets hit by the Ford Fiesta, and it looks like it's not going to be that big of a deal, and so you just say, well, look, why don't you give us $1,000? And the insurance company says, okay, fine. Well, then your guy calls you the next day and says, you know what? It turns out that I've got this really serious problem because the seatbelt tightened up just enough across my midsection, and it turns out that I've got this very weird, pre-existing problem that was exacerbated very significantly by the seatbelt, and I'm going to have surgery. And uh-oh, now is that likely? No, but things do happen from time to time, and you do get what we call an eggshell plaintiff from time to time, somebody who's going to be very susceptible to serious injury from what would otherwise appear to be a rather minor matter. And so you have to be thinking about that as you begin to make that initial proposal. That's why it's so important that you have sort of figured it out, and why you need to be very thoughtful and careful about your initial proposal, because once you anchor in at that $1,000, it's going to be very difficult to get the claims examiner or the attorney to get away from that. So keep that in mind. Can you escalate a demand? Well, I just gave you a perfect example of when you can call back and say, look, you know what, I know I made my initial demand and said X dollars, but you know what, it turns out that these circumstances have occurred, and I'm withdrawing that. And here's why. If you ever escalate a demand, that is, you go beyond what you initially offered or your initial proposal, you better have a really good reason. You better have a very, very, very good reason to do that. That is highly unusual. In 20 plus years of doing this kind of work, where I've done a ton of negotiating, I've only seen that happen a couple of times. And only I remember it working once, is what I remember. One time it actually turned out that the initial demand was too low, and the case did not get settled despite my efforts to try to get it settled. It didn't, and the company I was working for at the time ended up paying quite a bit more money when they could have. I mean, they paid almost $50,000 more than the initial demand, and because there had to be an escalation because the injury turned out to be more severe than we originally anticipated. So, but escalating demand, very unusual and very rare, and only under very clear circumstances where it's obvious and appropriate. What about false demands? If you're a lawyer, in my view, again, I'm a Christian. I don't think I can, I think lying is wrong. I mean, I hope if you're a Christian, you think lying is wrong. I don't even believe in puffing. Okay, I think that's wrong. I think it's lying, and so consequently, I don't do it. And so I don't think you can ever make a false demand. Now, if you're going to be a Virginia lawyer, the last time I read the professional rules in Virginia, the way the Rule 4.1 is written, I don't, this is just me, and this is just my own interpretation of the Virginia rule, but I think that under that rule, the way it's written, at least the way it was written in the last time I looked at it, which was a couple of years ago, I don't think you can lie at all. I don't think you can make a false demand under that rule. So you need to be really, really careful in Virginia what you do. Now, that said, the rules, the professional rules, the model rules, if you look at the footnotes, they have, basically an escape clause for puffing, and the understanding that in negotiations people say things that are lies, and that it's understood that lying is part of negotiating. And frankly, I just don't accept that. I think you can do it without lying and without giving false demands. So it, it it's one thing to make a demand or initial proposal that is high and kind of at the edges of reasonableness. That's one thing, uh, but to blatantly just say things that are not true. My client needs let's say you're negotiating a commercial lease, and your client has three particular needs. They need a certain amount of space, a certain amount of square footage. They need the price of that square footage to be a certain level, and they need the facility that they're going to rent to have a men's and a women's bathroom. Okay, just whatever. It doesn't. You can think of other things. Well, you you can't go into the negotiation if you know that, and those are your client's requirements, and those are the requirements. Yeah, this is me talking, and again, you're going to have to live with your own conscience. You can't. I could not go in and say, well, we need a kitchen, we need this, we need that, and thinking, well, I'll give away the kitchen later in order to make sure I get what I want. That's not appropriate. In my opinion, I don't think it's appropriate under the model rules. I think our attorneys particularly ought to hold themselves to a higher standard. And as a Christian, I hold myself to a higher standard, so I would not do that. I would be honest and say, here's what we need, and I would negotiate from there. In other words, if we need a men's and women's bathroom, I'm going to ask for a really nice men's and women's bathrooms. Okay, I'm going to really push the envelope on that and try to get the best possible bathrooms I can get for my client. Maybe have a shower in there, and maybe gold-plated faucets. I don't know, but I'm going to ask for really super duper bathrooms. I'm going to ask for the best possible price on the square footage. I'm going to ask for the best possible location, and so forth. That's one thing, because my client certainly wants those things. They want the best possible that they can get for their money. But it's another thing altogether to say, well, we want a kitchen and we want a loft, and and we want 22 parking spaces when we have 5 employees. You just no, don't do it. Okay, and the other problem with that is if you're found out, you'll get a reputation, and you don't want that reputation. So take the things you need and that you want, and just ask. Again, you have to ask for more than you anticipate, and maybe I'm cutting too fine of a line on this, but it's one thing to ask for sort of the best possible result, knowing that it's unlikely they'll give you the best possible result, but asking for it, because you never know, they might say, oh, okay, we're fine with all that, and you kind of, oh, shoot, I should have asked for more. But that's one thing, but blatantly lying is a whole other thing, and enough said on that. Bulwarism, that is it's named after a guy named Bulwer, who invented the strategy to negotiate with labor unions, where they would make a very eminently reasonable demand offer to the labor unions and then say, that's it. This is a good demand. We're done. We're not going to talk to you anymore. We're finished. It was outlawed in the labor negotiation strategy. It's outlawed in labor negotiations for that reason. You can try that, and there's one of the auto insurance companies that's well known, uses that strategy, or at least has in the past used that strategy, where and their attitude was, they would say, well, here's our offer, and unless things change significantly, we're not changing our offer at all. You either take this or go to trial. And that was kind of their attitude. Same sort of thing. These are all, by the way, very competitive opening salvos. Making demands before negotiating, saying, well, I can't negotiate with you until you do A, B, and C. I don't recommend that, mostly because it's very risky trying to place demands on somebody before they even get to the negotiation. You're really pushing the envelope there, particularly in garden variety business negotiations that many of you will be involved in, or the kind of back and forth you would do with a criminal case. And it's not going to work very well, and most people aren't going to put up with that. What about cooperative first proposals? What about those? Well, one of the problems with making a cooperative first proposal is people assume that there's something up your sleeve, because it's not what they expect. They kind of expect that if you make the initial proposal, it's going to be more, it's going to be higher, it's going to be a little more extreme, because that's what everybody anticipates. Again, not obscene, but kind of out there a little bit. So you risk the possibility of actually creating more work for yourself because people don't understand what you're doing. If you're going to do that, here's what I would suggest. Do it when it's a fairly routine circumstance. I would say if you're in a circumstance where you and the other negotiator know each other very well, and that would be a time where you can kind of get to the nub of things quickly. Hey, look, my client was, it's a DUI, but it's a .082, and you don't need to throw the book at him. This is barely over the limit, versus the .15, which is almost double the limit. Let's work this out. I don't know. But in particular, when you know somebody, you can jump in and say, look, here's what we need. Let's get this done. We both know where we stand on this. We both know where this is going to end up anyway. Let's just get to it. That's kind of the attitude that you would be looking at. What do you do if you get a cooperative first proposal? I mean, that's really more important than making one. I don't recommend you, by the way, that you do cooperative first proposals except in those circumstances, as I've already discussed. I just think for the most part it's probably not a good idea. But what do you do if you get one? And the reality is you kind of charge in, and you kind of have to say, I really need something better than that. And you almost have to in order to benefit your client. Now, it may be that the cooperative first proposal is insufficient for you anyway. What do you do if your client thinks it's perfectly fine? I think you take it. I mean, I think at that point you say to your client, here's the initial proposal. I think we could do better than this. And the client says, well, I don't need to do better than that. I think it's fine. Then you take it. Remember, the client always gets the last word on that. So if you can coax your client into pushing it and say, look, you really ought to get better than this in this deal, that's a legitimate concern. And again, the difference is, and some of you are already thinking, well, what's the difference between that and a false demand? Well, the difference is you're not making a false demand. You're not lying. You're not saying I don't want that. What you're saying is that's not good enough, and you are being honest. It's not good enough. It may be nice, and it may be decent, and it may be cooperative and helpful and all those sorts of things, but it may just not be sufficient. And it may not benefit your client sufficiently. So you've got to keep that in mind. Integrated first proposals, the main thing I want to talk about with those is if you are going to have a writing as a result of the negotiation, oftentimes it's valuable. And I know that the book discusses this, or I think it does. And again, it may be sometimes I get Getting to Yes confused. By the way, if you haven't bought Getting to Yes, that's fine. You don't need to, but I do recommend it. It's a worthwhile read. I don't agree with everything they say in that book. I think it's oddly enough, I think it's a bit naive in some ways. But nonetheless, there's a lot of good ideas in the book, Getting to Yes. If you're going to end up with a writing, sometimes it's a really good idea to start the negotiation with a proposal. For instance, if you're negotiating a lease or some kind of contract, maybe you start with a lease or a contract. You say, hey, look, this is what I've put together. What do you think? Make changes, make suggestions. And again, you get that anchoring concept, okay? If you give somebody something, a lot of times they'll get anchored into that. And if you've done it well, you may put yourself and your client in a really good position for bargaining purposes. So that's another way to start off your initial proposals. All right, well, that's it for Chapter 6, and I will let everybody, give everybody a time frame for Chapter 6 and getting the Unit 4 done, and then we will go from there.